Ryan, tell us what's on your radar.
A few weeks ago, we talked on this program about how the Department of Justice had stretched its indictment of Julian Assange so that it wouldn't look like the government was doing what it was actually doing, namely coming after a journalist for the crime of doing journalism. The U.S. doesn't want that impression to set in because then they get roundly mocked when they say things like this.
We remain deeply concerned over the continued detention of U.S. citizen Danny Fenster, who was working as a journalist in Burma. Yesterday, Danny marked his 100th day in detention. Journalism is not a crime. The detention of Danny Fenster and other journalists constitutes an unacceptable attack on freedom of expression in Burma. We continue to press Burma's military regime to release Danny immediately. We will do so until he safely returns home to his family.
And that's not just bad for the State Department, that's bad for the free press, and it's bad for journalists working in dangerous places. Because dictators feel comfortable cracking down, knowing they can just do a "what about Julian Assange?"
But if you raise this question, can I ask you also one? How do you assess what happened to Mr. Assange? Is it a reflection of free media in your country?
We're not here to discuss
no,
my
let's
country.
Discuss.
No,
let's discuss.
No, President
In order
Aliyev.
to accuse me, saying that Armenians will not have free media here, let's talk about Assange. How many years he spent in Ecuadorian embassy, and for what? And where is he now? For journalistic activity. You kept that person hostage, actually killing him morally and physically. You did it, not us, and now he's in prison. So you have no moral right to talk about free media when you do these things.
Returning to the conflict, how long...
better return to the conflict, because this is not what you like. You like only to accuse, only to attack.
Now, to be clear, the president of Azerbaijan is in fact cracking down on dissent. And it would be good if there was somebody with the moral authority to call that out. Danny Fenster absolutely should be free and back with his family. And I wish the U.S. demand carried more moral weight. Fenster and other imprisoned journalists around the world are the collateral damage of the U.S.'s war on WikiLeaks. Still, the U.S. wants the world to think Assange is not a journalist, therefore there's no crackdown on the press. Instead, the U.S. argues publicly Assange is a hacker. Now, as I talked about previously on this show, the actual indictment does in fact charge Assange with publishing documents, which means they are in fact charging him for journalism. But that fact is obfuscated in public with the focus on Assange as an alleged hacker. To make that case, the U.S. relies heavily on Siggy Thudarson, who was a teenager and a volunteer for WikiLeaks, and incidentally, he stole a lot of donations from them. Earlier this year, a major Icelandic news magazine reported that Thudarson was retracting his allegation. Assange had not, in fact, asked him to hack into anything, Thudarson said. This week, for the first time, the outlet published quotes and audio from the conversation. The first part is about documents and audio recordings that the indictment claimed were hacked from an Icelandic bank at the direction of Assange. In fact, Thudarson says he got the documents independently and simply handed them over to Assange. The indictment alleges that Assange asked Thudarson, quote, to hack into computers to obtain information including audio recordings of phone conversations between high-ranking officials, including members of the parliament of the government of NATO Country 1. NATO Country 1 in the indictment, that's Iceland. So here's Thudarson.
Julia. Já, sendi ég að fá lykilinn með þessu, sko. Með USB-lykilinn með símtöluna. Okay, þannig að hann fékk þessi símtöl. Allavega skrána, ég hlusta ekki á það, þannig ég tekst hvað á ég. Var ekkert, þið langaði ekkert að kíkja og heyra, ég meina, hvað var þetta stór fæll? Ég man ekki hvað, ég var að gera eitthvað, þannig ég hugsaði bara, ég hefði bara hendið Julian hann fyrir yfir kannski. Okay, en meina, hvað var þetta stór fæll? Þú veist, þetta hefur þá, var þetta 16 gigabit eða 32 gigabit? Nei, þetta hefur farið á 34-64 gigabit disk.
Later, the reporter talks to Thudarson about why the indictment says that Assange asked him to hack the bank.
Sagði þú við FBI að ég hafi hackað það? Já. Nei. Og að Assange hafi beðið að hacka það? Nei. En af hverju stendur það þá í ákærunni? Get ekki svaraði. Það að þú vilt það ekki eða þú veist, það FBI getur ekki svaraði? Ég get ekki svaraði. Af hverju getur ekki svaraði?
Af því ég má það ekki.
There's a lot more in the interview, and I'd encourage you to read the whole thing. The short version, though, is that the U.S. case against Assange relies entirely on the fact that he published documents the U.S. didn't want published. The only proper response to that is this.
Journalism is not a crime.
Ned Price is correct. Kim, what's it going to take to get the State Department and the Department of Justice here to do the right thing?
I mean, really good question. I think it's going to take a lot of the people obviously would have to come out and protest on behalf of Julian Assange. But unfortunately, there's just not that many people that care enough about this or, that want to do anything about it. I recently went to a protest to free Julian Assange. There weren't very many of us that were there. That was really unfortunate. We do have, according to this is this Committee to Protect Journalists. We have around the world 274 journalists currently detained by various governments around the world. And you bring up a great point that how can we call for a free press? How can we be the nation that stands up for this when we ourselves go after journalists, publishers, and whistleblowers? I mean, how can we make that claim? It's hypocrisy. And, like you said, the Azerbaijan president, okay, they definitely engage in this sort of thing, but he brings up a really great point. And I feel like he kind of succinctly said it in a way that makes the most sense, even though he himself is also guilty of the same crime.
And I always, like to remind people that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press for everyone. You don't need to be, there's no official, journalist is a colloquial term. There's no official designation journalist. You don't apply for a journalism license and then you're free to practice journalism. Anyone can do it. Everyone enjoys those freedoms. So it doesn't matter whether you want to technically term Julian Assange a journalist or not. He was entitled to release this information that the American public deserved because he has First Amendment freedoms. It doesn't matter whether he's technically a journalist or not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in fact, Daniel Ellsberg makes a persuasive argument that even applies to people who have security clearances. So in other words, if somebody leaks classified information to the media because they're blowing the whistle on something, that is a First Amendment protected activity, Ellsberg argues, and there are lawyers who would say that, yeah, that actually is true. If the CIA or the intelligence community wants to take administrative action against the person, strip them of their clearance, fire them, take their pension, they're well within their rights to do that. But to imprison somebody for speech is in direct violation of the First Amendment. And in fact, up until just very recently, it was never the case that whistleblowers were thrown in prison. So now it's almost become routine that whistleblowers are given prison time. And now with Assange, a journalist, the Department of Justice trying very hard to put him in prison.
There's definitely a big abuse going on here of what is considered espionage, right? So if you're going to charge somebody with this crime, it was that the law was developed or the crime was kind of enacted in order to go after people that were actually against the government, that were giving information to foreign governments that were trying to harm the U.S. in some way. It wasn't meant to go after whistleblowers and journalists, and yet it is used against whistleblowers and journalists time and time again. And that is not the purpose of the Espionage Act.
Right. And I can't get over the irony of people who call Assange a traitor. It's like the guy spent a couple days in the United States total. He's not even American. Right. Traitor to who? Anyway, we'll have Team Rising up next. More Rising after this.